Welcome back to Matter of Fact. Our conversation today is all about the semiconductor industry, one of the most strategically and geopolitically relevant industries in today's world. I am joined by Marc Hijink. He's a financial and tech journalist with deep knowledge of the industry, having spent many years covering ASML in particular for his book, Focus, which is I have right here, which is a great read that covers really the entire history of the company all the way back to its founding days. Thank you so much for being here, Marc.
Okay, thanks for having me, Damita.
Can you start by giving us an overview of how important chips currently are to the global economy, to our security, and sort of a little bit of an overview what the global chip industry looks like at the moment, who's at the forefront, and where ASML comes in?
Wow, that's a kind of a big question, but let's start off by just the conversation we're having right now. Without chips, it wouldn't be possible, of course, because we need an internet connection, we need a software and hardware running in our computers, in our webcams, and of course, digesting all the data that's in our interesting conversation and broadcasting in it to all of your viewers and listeners. So this is just one podcast, but if you look at the technology we use in our daily lives, in our cars, coffee makers, dishwashers, in the AI data centers that crunch on our stupid questions or interesting prompts, chips are everywhere. The corny way of phrasing it is chips are like the new oil, but I think they're more important than oil these days because it really is the ingredient for technology and for innovation, for defense, of course. So they're everywhere.
And also, nobody has strategic reserves yet.
It's very hard to keep chips in reserve because there's like this continuous development of new technology, more advanced or making these chips more efficient. So there's no sense in keeping them and stacking them up like oil. I was in a Microsoft Azure data center in the Netherlands, and they take out about 3,000 servers like every month just to be sure that these systems don't go down. A breakup in the technology we use, cloud system for example, would cause a huge economic effect. And just to be sure, as a precaution, they take out these servers and they change it for chips. So it's very hard to stock them. You need them on a daily basis.
And give us a little bit of a picture of which countries are at the forefront of this technology right now and why ASML is so important for the industry.
If you look back at the history of the chip, the majority of the technology was developed in the US back in the 50s. And that's also why Silicon Valley was called Silicon Valley, because there was a lot of silicon involved, the material you use to build chips. Throughout the last 5 or 6 decades, the industry has concentrated and moved to Asia, and specifically on just a couple of countries. If you look at the footprint of the semiconductor industry, it's relatively small. So the majority is in countries like Korea, Japan, Taiwan, of course, where TSMC has its headquarters, and also in China. And you see it now spreading all over the world, but there has been a tendency to trust these supply chains in Asia. As tensions grow in geopolitical ways, but also earthquake, for example, Western countries realize that they're very dependent and quite vulnerable when it comes to the supply chains of these semiconductors. So what you see happening now is that there's a huge uptake of investment in Western countries to try to lure Asian chip makers to also build fabs, chip fabs in the US, for example, in Arizona, but also in Europe, where you see huge investments in Dresden. And that makes sense because you don't want to be too dependent on this very important ingredient of your economy, and you wanted to de-risk these supply chains. And ASML as a company builds these machines that are necessary, critical for very advanced chips, and everywhere where there's a huge expansion or new fabs, ASML comes in and provides its tools because it's kind of the monopolist in the tools it makes, which is a giant photocopier, I usually call it. So it's a lithography machine. It uses light to project a chip structure on a silicon disk. And it does that really quickly and really accurate. And there's no other company in the world that can provide similar technology. So ASML kind of grows at the same speed as the semiconductor industry, which means that it's now up for a huge leap of growth in the coming decades. So they're expecting to hit the 60 billion euro revenue ramp somewhere around the 2030s, which is huge for the Netherlands.
You call their machines in the book the most important machines on Earth, which makes sense now that you've explained what they do, right? Shouldn't that give Europe massive geopolitical leverage?
If you look at the AI stack in total, the geopolitical issues are mainly about the access to AI and the rivalry between the US and China on which economy or which country has the most powerful AI. Because with artificial intelligence, you can really modernize your economy, make it more productive, and also increase the efficiency of your defense. So AI is very important for the next decade. And the technology you use to build AI is mainly based on very fast semiconductors, not only processors, but also the memory chips. And for those chips to manufacture them, you need these ASML machines. But they're just one layer in the total AI stack. You also need critical materials to produce these chips, the consumables to produce these chips. The semiconductor manufacturing industry, one of the reasons it's so successful in increasing all these processing powers and increasing the amount of compute is that countries have their own expertise and all add to the same puzzle, which is creating more innovative technology. So ASML provides a very important part of the technology of this puzzle, but a lot of other countries also add to the same puzzle, which means it's hard to flex your muscles and say, well, you can't get our technology unless whatever, because as Europe, we are also depending on other countries. For example, Taiwan, who has to deliver like 80% of the most advanced chips to the rest of the world. It's very hard to play hardball in these cases.
It sounds like the semiconductor industry is incredibly complex, incredibly expensive, and also incredibly interconnected. Would it even be realistic for state or multi-state actors to try and build their own autonomous, independent semiconductor industry? Or is it really a sector that is always going to be globally interconnected because of its complexity?
I think you have to strike a balance between the advantages of global cooperation and building the most efficient supply chain and de-risking, because semiconductors are so important, chips are so important for daily life, for a society, that we can't depend too much on supply chains we don't have under control. De-risking means you could copy part of that supply chain for like 10, 15, 20%, which means that in the hard times you can find a solution. But de-risking is kind of limited, because if you copy fabs throughout the world, it could be done. It's hard, but you need these ecosystems, these hubs of all companies supplying to the semiconductor manufacturing facility. ASML, but also Applied, KLA, TEL, a couple of companies that are always there when there's a new fab. You need talent and you need people to run these fabs, because even though these fabs are highly automized, they still need maintenance and they still need care, and they need replacement of parts that wear out. And there's a limited amount of talent on the planet. So I think there's a physical limitation to the amount of de-risking, and just building and replicating the same supply chain over and over again makes the system of chip building way less efficient. I think that will hurt economies as well. But what we see happening is, for example, in China, there's a huge growth in the semiconductor industry. China used to be very depending on importing chips, and now it's trying to stay more sovereign. Yet there's still AI chips, for example, made by NVIDIA, that's not available in China. So there's still a need to cooperate, even with your biggest rivals on these topics.
Talk about where Europe stands in all of that. So obviously there has been a political push for more tech independence and more tech sovereignty, and especially sort of a shift away from the United States. And within that context, we heard the CEO of ASML, Christophe Fouquet, tell Politico in January that, and I quote here, "Everyone should be realistic on what it takes and how long it may take. There will always be a need to import key parts of technology supply chains from abroad." So, of course, the company interest for ASML is selling as much as possible to as many clients as possible. And that goes for any company, right? Companies have an incentive to play all sides wherever they can so as to maximize their revenue. Do you think European companies will manage to keep doing that in the long run, to stay out of the geopolitical rivalries? Or will there come a point, I mean, we're seeing it happen more and more, but will there come a point where companies really have to commit to a side, so to speak?
Companies want the most degrees of freedom for their shareholders to have a good business, and especially companies that are like monopolists or semi-monopolists, like ASML. They consider themselves a neutral player. So whomever orders a chip machine, if it's allowed by law, if there's no regulation limiting them, these chip machines will be delivered. So companies in themselves aren't like political aware. They're just following the rules, the local rules, and ASML is just such a company. But if Europe changes its rules and, for example, has a different approach to China or to the US, then the companies have to follow along and have to comply to these rules.
We saw surrounding this geopolitical rivalry last fall some upheaval around another company in the sector, Nexperia. It exemplifies really what's going on in the sector, and it exemplifies the geopolitical tensions that we're seeing. So can you tell us very briefly what happened? And in your opinion, what does it show about this rivalry between the US and China and where Europe finds itself in between?
Nexperia is like the complete opposite of ASML. So ASML builds a couple of hundred very expensive, exclusive, very complex machines. Nexperia does the opposite. It creates over 100 billion chips every year that are very cheap, very mundane, and they're standard products. Industry rice, that's what a lot of electronic manufacturers call it. So these are really small chips that only do one task. These are not complex chips, but they're spread out over the world. In every device you use, there are a couple of Nexperia chips usually. Especially cars. So the automotive industry is very depending on Nexperia chips. Even though they're cheap, they're in your window wipers, they're in your automatic gearbox, in your indicators. And what happened was Nexperia was acquired by a Chinese company. So Nexperia is a Dutch company. It's coming from the Philips family, just like ASML. It was acquired by a Chinese company back in 2017. And then there was a new Chinese owner, and he started pulling back technology from Europe to China. He was kind of forced to do so because the US was imposing export controls even on these mundane chips that Nexperia made. And Nexperia found itself in a no man's land between the US and China, still with a Dutch head. And then the Dutch government interfered. So there was a Dutch minister who said, okay, we have to freeze this company. We're going to take this very old law back from the 50s, from the Cold War era, and impose it on Nexperia. So the company was frozen. And then China also put an export ban on the chips Nexperia made in China. And there you see there was huge dependencies on a certain Nexperia chip manufacturing facility in China that a lot of people weren't aware of. For China, this was the opportunity to show the rest of the world, okay, we're really serious. We even expose export bans on our commodities, like these cheap chips, to force our will in negotiating with rivals. Or when you do something to us, we respond in a very forceful way. And this is what happened to Nexperia.
Why would the Dutch government freeze a company like that? And do you think they did the right thing?
I'm not the one to judge. I'm just the one to describe what happened. I think they wanted to freeze the company to prevent China from hollowing out the technology that Europe still has, which is a couple of front-end manufacturing sites in Hamburg and Manchester, UK. These provide chips that are very important for the automotive industry in Europe. For example, the German automotive industry, they use a lot of chips. If this technology would wind up in China and not be accessible in Europe anymore, we would be even more depending on a system rival, as China is often regarded in Europe. And that's the situation that the Dutch government wanted to prevent. The way they acted caused quite a stir. They took Nexperia by surprise and also didn't inform a lot of their partners. That created a forceful response from China, but also the car makers in Germany weren't amused. And also Brussels was taken by surprise. But it's kind of a new assertive approach of the Dutch government saying this is our technology and we want to keep it in Europe. We think it's important. even though it's mundane technology, we don't want to be even more depending on a Chinese supply chain.
So what does Europe need to do here very concretely? We obviously have these advanced lithography machines. We have some specialized chips. What do we need to do to reduce dependency? Is it simply building the capacity to produce more chips in Europe? Is it building data centers in Europe? Is it building the capacity for specialized chips?
You just named all the ingredients you need. If you look at the economic logics behind the semiconductor industry, first of all, you need demand. So you need demand from automotive makers, or you need AI data centers that need chips. And if they're built in Europe, well, then it also makes sense to build chips in Europe. That kind of lures semiconductor manufacturers from Asia who have the expertise to build these very complex semiconductors to Europe. And then you could also start providing your own technology, because we're still depending on US chip designs, mainly by NVIDIA. And what you see happening is there's a shift in AI from training these models to using these models, from training to inference. And that kind of needs a different approach to semiconductor or chip designs, which if there's a new approach, well, there's also a new possibility, a new option, a new window where new designers can come in. And for example, IMEC in Belgium is a research institute where there's a pilot line that actually could be potentially a very good way to test out these new designs based on European technology that could wind up in European data centers and that could be powered by European chip fabs. But you're still dependent on the raw materials, rare earth, these minerals you need, because China has a really important role in the supply chains of these rare earth, these commodities. To create a more resilient supply chain in Europe for these commodities, you really need decades of time to explore new mines or to find new partnerships. Europe is working on that, but it's going to take a lot of time.
To your mind, are European policymakers, European decision makers treating this issue of tech sovereignty with the urgency it deserves at the
Again, I'm staying away from having an opinion on what is happening in Brussels right now. I think it's good that it's being negotiated or discussed and that there's a sense of urgency, but we have seen this sense of urgency for quite a long time. And what I find so fascinating about the Nexperia case is, even though it's a relatively small and unknown company, that is the perfect example of ending up in the front lines of geopolitics. It makes it very tangible how these geopolitical storms can hurt an economy and can hurt your production lines. There has been a lot of concern about these technologies that are still coming, like very powerful AI and advanced chips that China might someday use for even better AI. But the economic power or leverage of supply chain restraints is actually way bigger, because it causes a production issue next week and not in a couple of years. The export ban on Nexperia kind of proved that you could hurt your opponent's economy within weeks. Realizing that you're so vulnerable to these whims of your geopolitical adversary could speed up the discussion in Europe. I think it's fascinating to see that Brussels now finally realizes that these countries, these 27 member states, should cooperate also on a technical level.
And we talked about the economy and the economic effect of supply chain restraint now, but an aspect that we haven't touched upon is the security aspect, right? Because chips are also in everything from drones to fighter jets. Isn't that arguably a much riskier dependency as well?
Well, military-grade chips used to be a different breed of chips. What's happening now at real front lines, so in Ukraine, for example, you see drones that are built with a lot of, well, commodity chips you also find in dishwashers or microwaves. So it's very hard to keep these supply chains apart. One of the reasons that also, like Western chips made by NXP or Nexperia, also wind up in Russian drones, because it's very hard to keep these markets apart. Cybersecurity is also a discussion, but this is an older discussion that started around 2018-19, when there was a huge concern about the growth of Huawei, the telco company from China, within mobile networks in Europe. There has been a huge pushback on that technology, mainly because there was a concern for kill switch or sabotage. And I think there's one of the reasons that it makes sense to be sovereign and to be less depending on foreign suppliers of semiconductors is that you need to secure your data, because our daily lives are so much depending on digital networks, not only for internet connections, but also electricity, our payment system. Our societies are quite vulnerable because of that, because they're so centralized. It's very easy to hurt a country that's very centralized and connected. Semiconductors in our daily lives, they're really controlling our lives. If you hurt the networks that connect everybody, connect our cars, our trains, our payment systems, then you realize that, you have to make sure you protect them in the right way with your own technology or with the suppliers you can trust.
It's been interesting to me that in a lot of the examples that we talked about mainly our dependency from Asia and China. But something we haven't really covered yet is how dependent we are of the United States. Do you think Europe can still see the United States as an ally under the current political leadership? Or do you think that it's time that Europe frees itself from this idea that we have a reliable ally on the other side of the Atlantic?
If you zoom out, there are a couple of answers to your question. First of all, there's a tendency of the US to focus its attention more on Asia than on Europe. And for the US, it makes sense to pull back some of the investments it made in European defense and point it at Asia, where they think is now the focal point of the world. The President of the United States these days is a little hard to predict. What you see is that he's very vocal on this trend to, for example, decrease American investments in NATO. Yet on the other hand, he's also very transactional when it comes to China. And so this is hard to create the right assessment of this Trump era. In the long term, I think the US will become a different ally to Europe. It will be very hard to be completely dependent from the US as well. And I think it is not in Europe's interest to completely cut ties with the US. It's not a realistic goal, because we have to look through all the turmoil and look at the long term and find a new, more balanced alliance that is in both of our interests, and find a way to conquer all these economical challenges coming from China that's heavily overproducing these days. So the overcapacity is also creating an issue for Europe as well.
I want to get your thoughts as someone with profound expertise in the tech industry on recent developments. Last week, Anthropic pulled its advanced models from the market at the request of the US government. Does something like that worry you?
I find it fascinating to see that the US can act really quickly on new developments and technology that is deemed very important. We were just talking about the cybersecurity issues and vulnerabilities in our society. One of the models that Anthropic built is very of discovering vulnerabilities in any kind of software. And the US wants to prevent its rivals from using these capabilities to attack, for example, Western countries or the US. And one way to block this software is to prevent Anthropic from adding subscribers from rival countries or from foreign countries. I think it's also an example of the way the world is changing now. So Europe, if it's depending on US AI models, isn't sure that it can access the most modern technology. So I think it's really the proof that Europe should build their own AI stack, become less dependent on technology that can be cut off. And it's interesting to see that you see this from both sides happening. So China's, for example, limiting the travel opportunities for AI talent, so for people who are very good at developing AI models. You see the US limiting access to its frontier AI models because, it wants to keep the technology for itself. The only way for Europe to act is to create an AI stack for itself, at least for these very important AI models. And so that's a kind of a positive spin, I think.
Final question, Mark. The ASML stock is currently at roughly 1,650 euros. Do you
It
still?
is. Well, I don't own any stock in ASML or in any other company.
Do you still see that as a good investment? As somebody who knows the company so well.
I'm not going to make any advice on your investment. So good for you if you have that as a hobby. But for me, I think it's fascinating to see how there's a huge appetite in investors and their belief that this AI hype is not going to stop. So we're not in a bubble. And this is also something that ASML kind of communicates. Yet on the other hand, we still have to see if all these huge promises of data centers are being built or AGI hitting stores in 3 years, or this huge terafab Elon Musk is planning to build, if that really comes through, and we could have a backlash. And so maybe that's my nature, but I usually am quite careful. But I don't want to spoil your hobby, so please do as you wish.
Mark, thank you so much for coming on Matter of Fact.